Good afternoon and welcome to the MCA. I'm Julie Rodriguez-Widholm, curator at the MCA and very proud co-curator of the Doris Salcedo retrospective, along with my colleague and wonderful director, Pritzker director Madeline Grinstein. I have the great honor this afternoon to introduce you to Doris Salcedo. Before I introduce Doris, however, I'd like to remind you to please silence your phones, but feel free to tweet, text, and share this experience. I'd also like to thank the sponsors who made today's program possible. Season support for the MCA Lecture and Conversation Series is generously provided by the Albert Pick Jr. Fund. This program is made possible by the Gloria Brackstone Solo and Eugene A. Solo, MD, Memorial Lecture Series. Thank you, Paulette Solo, for also joining us today. Doris Salcedo was born in 1958 in Bogota, Colombia, where she continues to live and work. In 1980, she earned a BFA in Bogota, followed by an MA from New York University in 1984, where her interest turned toward sculpture. In 1985, she returned to Bogota. Interested in arts education, she worked as director of the Instituto de Bellas Artes in Cali and taught sculpture and art theory at the Universidad Nacional de Colombia. Her return, however, also coincided with one of the most intense periods in the Civil War that has befallen Colombia since 1948. Her deep empathy towards the victims of political violence impelled her to redirect the focus of her work, the results of which we have the honor of viewing today. Since the early 1990s, Doris has gained recognition as one of the leading sculptors of her generation. Her work is represented in the world's greatest museums, including the Guggenheim Museum, the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, the Art Institute of Chicago, the Tate, and of course, the MCA Chicago. Her work has been included in the most important international showcases of recent years, including the Carnegie International, Sao Paulo Biennale, and Documenta, among other venues. Doris has been the recipient of numerous significant awards, most recently, just last year, the Hiroshima Art Prize for Peace in Japan. We are honored to host her first ever retrospective spanning nearly 30 years and including all major bodies of her work, many of which have been brought together for the first time since their initial showing. We are equally delighted that the exhibition will travel on to the Guggenheim Museum in New York and the Perez Art Museum in Miami, where it will impact that many more audiences. For 30 years, Doris's work has addressed pressing social issues, violence, racism, and other crimes against humanity that affect us individually and collectively. The work also asks that we go beyond the fleeting headlines and statistics to consider the families and the individuals whose daily lives are forever disrupted by such traumas. Domestic furniture appears throughout her work to signal the realm of the everyday lived experience that has been disrupted, when the familiar becomes strangely unfamiliar. The work makes absence tangible, referring in part to the phenomenon of the disappeared in Colombia, but also in terms of political invisibility. The work engages with these highly relevant social issues related to how we maintain our humanity in times of war and conflict. How do we return dignity to those who have been stripped of their humanity? How do we share experiences with those kept on the fringes of society? And how do we negotiate difference and otherness? Doris's work combines the elements that make a great work of art: a singular aesthetic, a mastery of her materials, and soulful investigations into the human condition. It is both specific and universal. It is urgent and timeless. Doris's work is unforgettably haunting. It will imprint itself on your memory forever. It has certainly changed my life over the last 5 years of planning this exhibition. We thank Doris Salcedo for the gift of her art, and now for the gift of her words. Please join me in welcoming Doris Salcedo.
Thank you so much for being here today. Now that I have installed the survey show, I realize how profoundly indebted I am to all the people who have made it possible, for me to present these works here at the MCA. If I were to be fair and give proper credit, I would keep you here for hours on end. Due to time limits, I need to be brief. I would like to thank Madeleine Greenstein, not just for working 5 years on this exhibition against all odds, me included, but for the unwavering support she has bestowed to my work for the past 21 years. To Julie Rodriguez, who generously has devoted these last 5 years to working on the show, and to all the crew at MCA, whose help has been invaluable. Thanks to Karen Alexander and Jay Joplin for always being supportive of my work, no matter how unreasonable it seemed at times. And many thanks to the group of architects and artists who passionately and generously give their creativity and intelligence to the making of these pieces, regardless of the gigantic effort this entails. To Joaquín Sanabria, Carlos Granada, Ingrid Raymond, Sergio Clavijo, Roberto Uribe, and Waldo Castaño, who at times provide support to the pieces and at times to me. It is strange to be here today about to give a talk on the work I have produced in the past 30 years, and yet with the absolute certainty that I am just a beginner who knows little of art. But on second thought, actually, there is nothing strange about this, because art is about not knowing. Art is a constant reminder of the fact that rules, norms, and acquired knowledge are insufficient to render visible all that which lays on the edge of what, from the perspective of the establishment, should remain invisible, unnamed, and faceless. Art is not about knowledge. It is, as Kierkegaard wrote, about discovering something, quote, that thought cannot think, something impossible, something at the frontier of thought and desire, but desire understood in Lacanian terms as the unknown par excellence, the unknown of the inexistent, the void, the impossible. I have produced all of my work in Colombia at the edge of the void and the unknown, driven by the obsessive need to render visible the experience of the most vulnerable and most anonymous victims of political violence. By now, I should be used to working from the unknown, since it is the situation in which I place myself every time I start working on a new piece. But I am not used to it, because it is a paradoxical, disorienting, contradictory situation, appropriately defined by Kafka as, quote, universally impossible, unquote. In a letter to Max Brod, he stated the 3 impossibilities he faced as a Jewish Czech writer writing in German. Quote, the impossibility of not writing, the impossibility of writing in German, and the impossibility of writing any other way, to which, he says, he's tempted to add a 4th, the impossibility of writing, unquote. These impossibilities, and many more, define for me the creative act, an act in which, as Jacques Derrida instructed us, one should only do, quote, what is impossible, that ought to be the impossible rule. Art's main task is to open up the possibility of the impossible, and for this reason, art exceeds us. According to Alain Badiou, it is what exceeds the stable borders of the presently possible, unquote. Art exceeds knowledge, and specifically the knowledge we have of what it means to be human. The poet Paul Celan thinks that in every work of art, quote, even in the least ambitious, there is this ineluctable question, this exorbitant claim, unquote. For Celan, art is the impossible path an artist must follow. Art is en route towards a you that is constantly fading away from our grasp, and art attempts to make possible this impossible encounter. Working with art is synonymous of working with the impossible. The impossible simply forces its way into everything I do. Derrida stated that a work begins by the impossible, not with the impossible, as with some initial inquiry that seems impossible, but rather pushed or shocked into action by the impossible, unquote. The impossible pushes its way into my work, for example, when I need to make the ground cry drops of water that will join together to slowly write the names of victims of gang violence in the United States. Or, against all odds, when grass grows underneath a wooden table, or when a shroud is made with rose petals that do not wither, or when it is necessary to build a wall downwards instead of the usual upwards. Sometimes my tasks seem impossible because each time I need to make a different, radically different piece to honor the singularity of each and every victim's experience. So different, I need to go from animal fiber to stainless steel, and sometimes from extremely heavy to immaterial. As you can see from these images, I do not accumulate knowledge. Every time, my point of departure is a tabula rasa. And yet, the presence of the impossible is most intensely present in the inherent contradiction each piece must somehow resolve. Today, looking back 30 years, I think these contradictions constitute the work's very essence. But maybe the contradiction I find more disoriented and challenging is the unfamiliar place from which I make the pieces. Every single piece I have ever made has always begun with the testimony of a victim of political violence, whose experience is a requirement for the very existence of my work. And for this reason, from the beginning, I appropriated Deleuze's belief that artists must be forced into an exercise of depersonalization in order to produce works that are far removed from the autobiographical and strongly connected to a political immediacy. In his text, The Meridian, Celan assesses this contradiction. For him, an artist is, quote, he who has forgotten all about himself, and in this manner art moves with the oblivious self into the uncanny and strange, unquote. But later, on the same text, he argues that only the artists who speak from an angle of reflection, which is their own existence, their own physical nature, can reach the mystery of an encounter, unquote. My work is about extreme experiences lived by victims of violence. It is not about my own experience. Therefore, the work is made from an oblique perspective, a place of insufficiency from which a fragmentary, incomplete history is precariously told and retold. The place from which I have tried to produce my work is exceptionally presented in this poem by Osip Mandelstam. What I am saying now is not being said by me. It is dug from the earth like grains of petrified wheat. In spite of the fact that the work always proceeds from a specific life experience, I need to create in each piece a radical silence. I believe art stands at the paradoxical intersection of silence and eloquence. Every one of my pieces goes towards a victim, but during the process of making the piece, I have to make sure I keep a distance in order to leave that person intact, untouched. The work departs from the singularity of a life experience that is linked to suffering and pain, but once these experiences become part of a work of art, they should become silent and strangely neutral. In the midst of so much contradictions and so much uncertainty, I have decided to hold firmly to Lacan's imperative, quote, "Do not give up on your desire," unquote. And this has become my strongest and sometimes only guide. To be faithful to the peculiarity of my desire as an artist demands, Badia tells us that it demands, a radical repudiation of all merely consensual social norms in favor of an exceptional affirmation of these aspects of reality that are placed on the border of what is formless or monstrous. In my work, I have addressed only one issue, political violence. I have focused on political violence, not simply because I am Colombian, which in a way gives me a deeper and closer knowledge of its effects, but because I strongly believe violence defines the ethos of our society. Violent death marks the passage of a complete life into the industrial production of corpses that has characterized the 20th and the beginning of the 21st century. Death at an industrial and epic scale, but at the same time reduced to its utmost insignificance, trivialized, and as such inscribed into our normal everyday life. I believe that art, on the other hand, can inscribe in our life a different kind of passage, that is, from suffering to signifying loss. And it is for this reason that for the past 30 years, I have remained immersed in mourning, and my work has been the work of mourning. Therefore, I believe my work plays a role that is quite similar to the funeral oration, and it begins at the same time, at the same moment, the instant Derrida calls, quote, "the end of the world." My work addresses a person who is no longer here at the moment when she or he can no longer hear us, and it addresses when there remains nothing to be said. This salutation, or final adieu, according to Jean-Luc Nancy, quote, "gives the ruined world its dignity as world, and to the proper name, deprived of sense, it gives the totality of sense," unquote. I see my work as a topology of mourning, the only possible response I can give in the face of irreparable absence are images capable of conveying incompleteness, lack, emptiness. A work of art, as funeral oration, explores possible ways in which to formulate a poetics of mourning that not only affirms the work of mourning, but it is what Nuri Ghana calls a work in mourning. It attempts to get back the sense, meaning, and form that violence took away from its victims. And again, Nancy adds that these poetics of mournings also, quote, "give rise to that strange turmoil of crossing through life for nothing, but not exactly at a poor lost," unquote. There is nothing more human than mourning, on the devotion or contempt we bestow to our mourning practices resides our humanity. In his book, The Work of Mourning, Derrida describes the topology of the interiority of the person in mourning. He says that in the wake of death, even the proper name ceases to refer not to his deceased friend, but to an interiority. Quote, "Is he in me who I name? When I say in us, when we speak so easily and so painfully of inside and outside, we are naming space, we are speaking of a visibility of the body, a geometry of gazes, an orientation of perspectives, we're speaking of images," unquote. The immensity of mourning defines our limits. It marks a space to which we remain without access. Mourning marks a frontier we cannot penetrate, set apart from life by a line, a cut, a wound, And it is within these boundaries that I have tried to inscribe my work, marking a specific size for remembrance where acts of mourning could take place. I have devoted myself to creating images of mourning, since images are all we are left with once the beloved person has been taken away by a violent act. But in the case of political violence, these are not the only ones we are left with. Nancy says that violence always completes itself in an image. It always makes an image of itself. What matters in the exercise of force is the production of the effect that one expects from it. The violent person wants to see the mark he makes on the being he assaults. And violence consists precisely in imprinting such a mark. Violence imprints his image by force, unquote. In my work, I have tried to inscribe violent death without ever repeating or reproducing the violent act itself, but rather responding with images that differ essentially from it, because I think it is important to generate images that oppose the symbolic hegemony violence imposes on us. To find the limit of the representation of violence has been an essential part of my work. The question is how to present violence in a work of art without violence. How can I generate images that do not reproduce the violent act without addressing it? While addressing it? Jorge Luis Borges has given me a possible answer. He writes that, quote, the immanence of a revelation that does not come about is perhaps the aesthetic fact, unquote. Borges' definition of art allows us to conceive of ways to present art, to conceive of ways to present in art violence without violence. This consists precisely in the revelation not taking place. It is remaining imminent. This type of image is the opposite of violence, which reveals completely. Violence is hyper-representation, as Hollywood and authoritarian regimes all over the world know very well. Marie-José Montaigne said that the great sight of vision in Western art harbored a concept of the image that demands a void at the heart of its visibility. What makes a work of art is, quote, that epiphany in absence that only occurred during an eclipse, unquote. For her, the image of a work of art should be like an eclipse. What is an eclipse? Quote, an object comes between the viewer and the sun and darkens the world of ephemeral forms while its outline is illuminated by the fire that it hides, but whose brilliance we are momentarily able to contemplate, unquote. This brilliance that we are momentarily able to contemplate is the only image art can give us. For her, the sense a work of art presents is sense eclipsed, and the image should be an eclipsed image. Nancy established a difference between being there in the world and being image. The image a work of art presents is not there, but over there in a distance, and this distance is called absence. In this sense, he writes that contrary to what is commonly believed, the imagination of an artist does not reside in the faculty of representing an object or a person in its absence. On the contrary, he says that imagination is the force that draws the form of presence out of absence. The absence of the imagined subject is nothing other than an intense presence, unquote. The experiences I try to address in my work are not anecdotes. My work is not about experiences taken from life. It is about the memory of experience, always vanishing. It is the vacuum generated by forgetfulness. The work of art is concerned precisely with that which is not an event. It points towards an event, or as Nancy writes, in a work of art, an event and eternity coincide in the intensity of an image. The events my work addresses are in the process of appearing and disappearing. Therefore, they can never be fully grasped. Derrida says that art articulates what is no longer with what is not yet. These sculptures are the only locus where these distant events take place. My work is a vain attempt to recover the irretrievable. More than inert, silent pieces, I see these pieces as acts, hopeless actions, as though what could amend reality. In them, different times are juxtaposed because the time of violence, as Hamlet said, is out of joint. It is a dislocated time, and in a way, it is in this disjuncture of time that a work of art can open up a space in which to bring into our presence the repressed and forgotten presence of the victims of the past. And yet, I could summarize my work with one word: impotence. My work is about impotence. It is a sum of impotences, not being able to solve anything, lacking the capacity of fixing anything, not seeing, not being able to reach a presence. In the aftermath of violence, we are caught between hope and impotence. And I think this piece on land, this twofold experience is present, suggested by the difficulty to see clearly, and this difficulty bears with it a feeling of proximity, maybe the proximity of an almost possible presence, but however, there is only absence. I have tried to describe my work precisely in the threshold where this absence makes itself present. Where this absence makes itself present. In spite of the fact that I am a sculptor working with solid matter, I perceive this fragile threshold as something untouchable, like an image or a wound. This piece of Flor de Piel is concerned just with this untouchable aspect of a wound. A Flor de Piel started with the simple intention of making a flower offering to a victim of torture in an attempt to perform the funerary ritual that was denied to her. The genesis of A Flor de Piel arose when I began to wonder, how could I initiate even the slightest movement towards a tormented body, if only to present my flower offering? At this point, I began looking for the most fragile way of touching the untouchable. The process of making this piece pushed me to find the limits of the fragile and the most delicate within the frame of sculpture. The elaboration of A Flor de Piel represented a difficult challenge, trying to maintain a rose petal in a stage that is neither dead nor alive. I treated them so they remain suspended between the reign of the animate and the inanimate. I needed a shroud made out of rose petals that are simply sutured to one another. To me, making this piece represented the unattainable aim to shroud the extension of bodies torn away from life and never properly delivered to death. This is a delicate and almost insubstantial piece. It is, in a way, what defines this piece is our gaze, our relationship with it. It is a thin shroud, an interface that makes possible the idea of coming close to touching while making evident the impossibility of a caress, of healing, and of saving from the abyss of death. Violent death lays beyond the scope of art. Montaigne writes that death cannot be represented because it is the ultimate profanity, and as such, it escapes all symbolization. Death is not representable, and for this reason, in art, it should be substituted not by the category of emptiness, but of hollowing out. Its content, argues Montaigne, should be emptied out to allow it to appear anew in the time and space of the sacred. Perhaps what art could represent is the death of death, and this is precisely what I hope to attain with Plegaria Muda. Our society generates margins, exclusions, in which it places the part of the population that, in the eyes of the administrative power, are perceived as surplus, redundant population. This population is forced to dwell not only on the periphery of cities, but on the periphery of life. They inhabit the most external border of humanity, and there they remain displaced from the human genre. The process of investigating this work began in 2004 with a trip around Southeast LA. I focused my attention then on the violence caused by gangs, and particularly on the murky relationship that is established between the role of the victim and the role of the killer. After reflecting on this, I realized that this perverse and fluid swap between roles was possible because both inhabit an undefined gray area, which some writers have called social death or death in life. Social death is experienced by people living in deprived areas under precarious conditions. Its consequences are tragic. One can easily see the connection that exists between the so-called social death and the subsequent violent, anonymous physical death. The conditions that generate these social deaths are quite similar all over the world, whether in LA or in Bogota. Plegaria Muda is a response to a particular event that took place in Colombia between 2003 and 2009, in which approximately 2,500 young people from deprived areas were murdered by the Colombian army and then presented as unidentified guerrillas discharged in combat. The death of each young person generates an absence that demands that we take responsibility for those who are missing, since the only way they can exist is within us. Our relationship with them does not end with their death. It lives on. It lives on as grief. Hans Jos Frey argues that in the face of death, the end of our hope survives as mourning, as a sign of the infinite incompleteness of our relationship with the dead. Colombia has been the country of the unburied dead. We have hundreds of unidentified mass graves where the dead remain nameless. For this reason, I needed to inscribe the image of the grave in this piece, Plegaria Muda. It highlights each tomb individually, despite not being marked with a name. Each piece has been sealed and has an individual character, as if to indicate that a funerary ritual has taken place. The implacable and obsessive repetition of the tomb emphasizes the painful repetition of this unnecessary death. I hope that in spite of everything, life might prevail, even in difficult conditions, as it does in Plegaria Muda. I will try to briefly present a few public art pieces I have made in the past 15 years, in quite different locations, addressing quite different events. In spite of the fact that these pieces are site-specific and refer to a specific event, they affirm those aspects of life that are addressed to all, regardless of origin, difference in culture or ethnicity or religion or whatever. I made pieces based on the violent. The first one I'm going to present is a piece that I made based on the violent seasons of Colombian Supreme Court on November 6 and 7, 1985. The piece was made in 2002. A guerrilla commando took by force the building of the Supreme Court. The army, retaliated in an equally brutal way, and as a result, a two-day total war broke up in Bogota's downtown. Approximately 126 people died, including the justices. On the 6th and 7th of November 2002, I presented this ephemeral work on the facade of the new Palace of Justice. This act of memory began on November 6 at 11:35 a.m., time when the first victim, a guard of the building, was killed. At that instant, an empty chair was slowly lowered along the southeast facade of the Palace of Justice. This action was repeated several times for 2 complete days, the duration of the battle. The piece presents an image that respects the tension between remembering and forgetting, in which the survivors and family struggle year after year. The image I propose is at the intersection between the wish to remember and the impulse to forget. The piece I made for the Istanbul Biennial is a topography of war inscribed in the midst of everyday life, an image where the private and the political collide, producing a complete sense of disorientation. The piece presents a sealed, circumscribed, and airless image. It is an intense, incessant piece, compulsively inscribed into an opening. On making emphasis on the flat surface, the stress is placed on detail, and what is offered to the view is a proliferation of detail. The more you look, the more you understand that its scrutiny is useless. The piece is made with 1,550 chairs that intercept up to the point where both logic and order collapses. W.G. Sebald poses a question about how to form a language in which terrible experiences capable of paralyzing the power of articulation could be expressed in art. I asked this question to myself when making this piece. How to find a way to address concentration camps, both historical ones and their contemporary version? How can we live a tranquil, peaceful, happy life knowing of the existence of concentration camps today? This piece is an attempt to find an answer to these questions. Neither is a piece about uncertainty and ambiguity. Neither is simultaneously located outside and inside the epicenter of catastrophe. I wanted to juxtapose an interior space with the utmost image of exteriority, wire mesh. It is an interior space that negates the possibility of interiority, intimacy, and remembrance. Space is a fundamental category for any form of power. Architecture represents its potency, its social order, and its objectives. Architecture of power is made explicit in this room at the Castello de Rivoli. I thought this room had an absolute and totalitarian character. The piece I installed in it emphasizes both the form and the character of this grand space. It was clearly a space of political practice, and this remains evident today, more than a century and a half after it ceased to be a center of power. Abyss is a tool to decode the history and nature of this impressive and at times unapproachable space. Abyss addresses the sheer extra weight the powerful ones exert over disenfranchised populations by simply building a wall downwards and then stopping just before the space becomes totally entombed. We know the worst moments of history have been defined by racial hatred. The rejection of the immigrant marks the trend towards separation, disintegration, and racism. And this is the space Shibboleth intends to delineate. Shibboleth, whose charge has always been to determine who can cross and who should die in the attempt, is placed here to mark the unbridgeable gap that separates humanity from infrahumanity. The piece is about absolute indifference. No cultural ornament attenuates the desolation and destitution it is addressing. The piece is inopportune and apparently out of control. It intrudes in the turbine hall. Its occurrence seems to be the product of an irrational event crossing through a rationalist building. Its appearance disturbs the museum in the same manner the appearance of the immigrants disturbed the consensus and homogeneity of European societies. Although I'm well aware of the fact that a critique of immigration is nothing new, I simply wanted to address this issue from the perspective of art, analyzing the role art played in the formation of the stereotype of human beauty. Western art constructed a radiant image of whites against the erased figures of all other peoples. Non-whites are faceless, and those faceless people have through centuries been those who must be hated and assassinated. In spite of the fact that these pieces are quite different from one another, there is one element that remains constant in all of them: an unwavering faith in art's ability to affirm the necessity of not remaining silent, even when addressing, as MCA says, those issues of which one cannot speak. But faith understood as an act, and it is through these acts that I have been able to think the unthinkable experiences I just presented. The making of my work is like a solitary liturgy where the unbearable, the unknowable, and the impossible are accepted and forged into images capable of generating the yes, yes with which Derrida defines faith. For him, faith is a general affirmation which must be repeated from moment to moment to give us a reason to live on. Thank you.